All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to First Wednesday, the power of belonging. Yes, let's give a clap if you're excited to be in the house tonight. All right, I'm excited about tonight. We're going to be talking about the power of belonging, and I want to put up a number here where if you have questions, you can text questions to this number. Now, reality is we got about 10 different people. It's going to be like rapid fire tonight. We're going to have a lot of stuff tonight, so we may not have time to get to those questions tonight, but if we don't, we're going to be doing a podcast episode as a follow-up to this. We'll be able to dive deeper. So text your questions in to this number tonight, but let's dive in, the power of belonging. By the way, my name is Josh Butler, one of the lead pastors here at Redemption Tempe. So stoked you're here. Let's go. Okay. All right, so Holly and I spent 3 months in Africa back in the day, and we lived with a local family there in a house with 21 people. There were grandparents and aunts and uncles, relatives visiting from afar, and we were unofficially adopted as daughter and son. Their home was an expansive circle of love. Now, the hospitality there was amazing. The food was simple, but it was always around. Children from the neighborhood came in and out, finding it a place of safety and refuge and rest. And everyone had a place at the table. You knew you belonged. We're talking about belonging tonight, the power of belonging. And I want to start with this African statue that we often saw while living there. This is from the Shona people of Zimbabwe, and it depicts the family as diversity in union. We see diversity in the family. We see the diversity of father, mother, and child, 3 distinct persons, yet each with a unique identity of their own. And yet they are not only diverse, they also have union. They share one substance, flesh and bone, body and blood, united in the nature of their being and life together. The family, this is a window into a powerful truth that the family is an icon of the Trinity. The family is a window into the triune life of our eternal God. Both Karl Barth, the most influential Protestant theologian of the 20th century, and Pope John Paul II, the most significant Catholic theologian on body and sexuality, both saw the family as a unique window into the life of the Trinity as a communion of persons. This means God built into creation through the family the reality that you were made to belong. Tonight, we're going to be looking at this, the reality of belonging. Tonight, on the first half of tonight, we're going to go more big picture. We're going to be talking about the Trinity and family and friends and friendships and rich relationships and community and how we're made to belong and what happens when that gets broken. And then in the second half tonight, we're going to get more practical on how to make friends and keep friends and build connection and cultivate belonging. But let's start with God. A good place to start is with God, right? Let's start with the Trinity, who is lover, beloved, and love. Lover, beloved, and love. This is a popular image for the Trinity in church history, where the Father, as the first person of the Trinity, is the lover. The Son, as the second person, is the eternal beloved. And the Spirit, as the third person of the Trinity, is the unbreakable bond of love between them. Now, there is a triune shape to love. Wherever love exists, St. Augustine observed, 3 things are present. You have the lover, which is the one who loves. You have the beloved, which is their object of affection. And then you have the love, which is the bond that exists between them. Take coffee, for example. Got any coffee fans in the room, right? Yes, there we go. So with coffee, you are the lover, right? The coffee is your beloved target of morning devotion. And the love is the magnetic bond which draws its warm, savory goodness like a tractor beam towards your lips. Right? With ristretto, as with romance, there is a triune shape to love. Now, with love, the lover is always a person, right? Love is a personal category. People love things, but things don't love people. You can love your espresso, but you'll be waiting a while if you're expecting your espresso to love you back. Right? With God, the lover behind all creation is not a thing, but a person. God himself, the Father, the first person of the Trinity, is the eternal fount of love from whom all things flow. And the Father is the giver of life and a lover of the life he has made. Now, love is most powerful, however, when the beloved is also a person rather than a thing. My fondness for my wife runs a lot deeper, hopefully, than for my latte. Why? Well, because if the beloved is a person, love can be reciprocated. A person can love you back. Reciprocal love, this is the root of deep friendships, of healthy marriages, and of strong parent-child relationships. Reciprocal love is the root of healthy community and belonging. When it comes to God, the beloved is not a thing, but a person, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, who eternally loves his Father, delights in his affection, and eternally reciprocates the love he receives. All right, well, now here, this is where the family gets interesting, because normally, while lover and beloved can both be people, the love itself is always a thing, an abstract force between them, or at least almost always. In the life of the family, when a husband and wife come together, the love that arises between them can become concrete in the person of the child. The child is not a thing, but a person who joins them to participate as a member in their circle of love. The child is ideally encircled within their embrace of affection, similar to how the Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, is not a thing, but a person, the love that is the bond of affection between the Father and Son, who proceeds from the Father through the Son and joins in their communion together. So with the family, if you think of that African statue again, where you have lover, beloved, and love, the love that arises between them, where love is ideally, it is generative, it is life-giving, and here we have three persons, one substance, distinct and yet sharing flesh and bone, body and blood. Ideally, they are a communion of love where everyone belongs. Well, what's this mean? If this is an icon or a window into the greater reality of God's purpose for humanity, what this means is that you were made to belong. You were made to belong. Can you imagine living in perfect love, a circle of giving and receiving, of knowing and being known in secure relationship where there is nothing to prove and no one to impress, of not needing to earn an identity or perform for your value and worth? Rather, you were made to receive your identity as a gift from outside of yourself in an unbreakable communion of mutual self-giving. You were made for this reality. All of us, we want this love. You need this love. You were made for this kind of love. You were made to belong. God, and this goes much bigger than just the family, God designed the family, but it's a window into his purposes for the human community, for the community of life as a whole, to reflect something of his divine love as Trinity, where each person outdoes the other, seeking to lift up and shine a spotlight on each other. Like the African artist who sculpted that statue in order to image a human family, so the grand artist, God, has sculpted the human family to image something of his own existence as a communion of persons, that we, in the life of the human community, might reflect that belonging and that love into the world. Okay, well, what does this mean? Again, it means that you were made to belong. Neurobiology confirms this, like the study of the brain. It's interesting. They find that children who grow up with secure attachment, where they are known and they are loved, that it shapes their neural pathways and their brain development. It's much more than just the words that you've heard as a child as you're growing up. It's all your whole body. The science has found that your body as a child is growing up, you're soaking in your whole environment. Things like eye contact, tone of voice, facial expression, body language, healthy touch, gestures, all this impacts the way a child's mind develops, their experience of being known. Your relationship with your primary caregivers growing up, through your attachment to them, it shaped your brain circuitry, for better or for worse. The patterns there established and shaped your neural pathways. Now, ideally, these are loving, reflecting the love, security, and belonging of the Trinity, but we live in a broken world with broken families, and all of us are broken in some way or another. None of us are perfect. All of us have been impacted by the weight and the gravity of the fall. Yet here's the good news, is that no matter how broken your upbringing was, there is good news. There is healing in healthy relationships. Say that again, there's healing in healthy relationships. I think this is why Jesus calls the church to be a redemptive family, not a biological family, but the family of God, brothers and sisters in Christ before our Heavenly Father. Because when you are known in deep friendships and with healthy community, it changes your brain. Science has found that healthy relationships, it reroutes your neural pathways and can, over time, heal the damage that we've experienced right now. Did you know that when a person tells their story to a listener who has empathy for them, where you truly feel heard and understood, that science has found both the person telling their story and the listener themselves both undergo actual changes in their brain circuitry. It begins to reroute this belonging. It begins to reroute your neural pathways so that they can be shaped again by the belonging you were made for. In the storytelling with others, these people experience decreased anxiety. You feel a greater sense of emotional and relational connection and a greater awareness of and compassion for others. In other words, healthy relationships where you're truly known, like the good and the bad and the ugly, can actually change and rewire your brain, healing damage from earlier in life and making you a healthier person. God is a relational God, Father, Son, and Spirit, lover, beloved, love, and he has made you for relationship. Now, you need more than just information in these relationships. You need presence, the embodied presence of other people. This is where true belonging is found. Do you know why Zoom makes us so tired? Zoom fatigue, that four-letter word, Zoom, these days? Well, it's because we use our bodies to communicate upwards to 85 to 90% of what we quote-unquote say. That nonverbal cues, again, things like eye contact, tone of voice, facial expression, body language, gestures, timing, and intensity of responses, these things are happening subconsciously. You're not thinking about it, but your body is saying and receiving these things without you even thinking about it. And yet, when we are only online, disembodied, your body is looking for those signals with other bodies of other people that it can't find. Kurt Thompson, a Christian psychiatrist, he compares your body in this scenario looking for others. He compares it to a cell phone looking for signal, and it can't find it. It wears you down. You get fatigued. You get irritable. You get angry. This is why we were all so angry and short-fused during the pandemic, right? Because we crave connection. We crave connection. Again, Kurt Thompson, he says it this way. He says, our Creator has formed us in such a way that there is nothing more crucial to our long-term welfare than connection with others. That without healthy relationships, he goes on to say that an isolated person, in both their brain and their body, if you're isolated from others, he says, quote, a single mind becomes anxious, then depressed, then hopeless, and then dies, either by intentional means, suicide, or more passive forms of self-care, end quote. But with healthy relationships, he goes on, people with rich friendships on average find healing and are greatly happier, healthier, have better physical and mental health on average, and live longer. Okay, so big picture, you and I were made to belong by a triune God, and community and powerful relationships can bring healing to us. Later tonight, we're going to get to the practical. How can we make and keep healthy friendships? But first, still, for this first half of the night, I want to ask now, what happens when belonging gets broken? Let's take a closer look at what happens when belonging gets broken. I want to introduce you to Sarah Padburry. Sarah is a writer and producer. She's here at Redemption Tempe, and she's currently working on a short film called Izidor. And I was just, blown away when I started seeing this film that she's working on the story. It's about Izidor Ruckel, who grew up in a Romanian orphanage. And it's about the power of belonging when he's later brought into a family. The film's motto is, quote, to belong is to be alive. I believe this is a window, her work here is a window into the power of belonging and the potential of healing relationships and good, healthy community for all of us. So before she comes up, let's watch this clip. This is from an interview with Morgan Freeman and Izidor, the subject of the film. And a warning, there are some graphic images in this clip from life in the orphanage, so feel free to look away if that might be bothersome to you. With that said, let's watch this clip.
This is the story of us. I'm in Southern California to meet Izidor Ruckel. Izidor grew up in a Romanian orphanage and didn't experience the love most of us take for granted, the love of a parent. You were born in Romania.
That is correct.
But you wound up in an orphanage at an early age.
I did. My parents took me to a hospital to be treated for my flu or cold. The doctor gave me an injection, and instead of the needles being sterilized and disinfected, it was used time after time on children after children, and I contracted polio. So my parents said, "What on earth did you do to his leg? His leg is dead, can't move it anymore." The doctor said he'd have to stay here for a couple of weeks. Once my parents left me there, they never came back. At the age of 3 years old, I was put in the hospital for the irrecoverable children and grew up there until I was 11 years old.
In the 24 years that Nicolae Ceausescu ruled Romania, many children shared Izidor's fate. Ceausescu decreed that every family must have at least 5 children or pay an extreme tax penalty. If you couldn't afford to feed 5 children, often the only option was to give some of them to one of Romania's overcrowded state orphanages. So, Izzy, you spent 8 years growing up in an orphanage. What was that like?
There are moments where you wonder, am I going to survive this? None of us were taken outside.
No sunlight?
No sunlight.
Looking around at where we are, playground, the trees, the grass.
We do not have anything like
Nothing
this.
close to it.
No. I wanted to show you this video so you could actually see it for yourself, what my life in the institution was in Romania.
I mean, even the building from the outside looks intimidating.
When you walk into the building, it smelled nothing but soaked urine and feces.
Oh my goodness gracious. About how many kids can you think live in that orphanage?
It would be about 400, 500 children.
400 or 500 children,
Yeah.
and not nearly enough people to look after
No.
them. Why are these children rocking back and forth?
Because children were never held as infants, and they were developing ways to nurture themselves, and rocking back and forth was one of the ways.
You experienced this.
I used to rock back and forth for a long time, and I grew out of that eventually.
Who was that kid?
That was me. That was me in 1990. I had more opportunity than others. I had a worker named Onisha, and I actually still have her picture. And I will never forget this woman. She was one of the most amazing workers that worked there. Onisha took me home for one night. I forgot about the institution. My experience at home was the greatest gift. She cared for me like I was her son. From that moment on, other workers saw my potential. Okay, I want to take him home too. And from there, it just gradually grew till I went home with almost the entire staff that worked there. It's because of them that I learned how to love, how to have compassion, how to care, how to have sympathy. I mean, I had never done that before. I never could hug someone.
Did you see this happen with any other kids?
No. I was very fortunate and lucky, and because of their love, I believe I was able to grow and develop a lot better than others.
Welcome, Sarah Padburry. Yes, welcome. Sarah, so you're a writer, filmmaker, a producer. As we were watching this clip, I was just struck by how Izidor's story and that depiction of life in the orphanage was like a tragic display of when belonging gets broken. You know, it was extreme, but it feels like a window into this greater reality that for all of us, we were made for community, for belonging, and when that gets broken, how tragic that can be. But can you talk a little bit about the storyline here? Because he alludes to Onisha bringing him home for a day, and I know that's kind of the heart of this film that you're working on, that you've written the screenplay for, and now you guys are filming. Can you talk about the storyline there and the power of him going home with Onisha, the nurse?
Yes. In our film, the orphans exist in this animated world. They aren't treated as human. In fact, they don't even know that they're human. All they know about life is they exist in this compound that has a 4-level dilapidated building surrounded by a 10-foot cement wall topped by barbed wire. And the only way in and out is through the front gate. So the kids just spend their days looking out the window at a world they're never allowed to touch. Until one day, Onisha takes Izidor home. And the moment they walk outside that front gate, the whole world transforms to live action. And Izidor gets to experience nature, the grass and the trees and animals. And most importantly, he gets to experience a family and belonging to them and good food, learning how to play, sleeping in a warm bed. And the next morning, he happily gets up to accompany his newfound mother figure to work. But he doesn't realize until he gets back to that same gate that Onisha's work is actually the orphanage. So he falls apart and begs her not to make him go back. But that's where he belongs, so she pulls this sobbing little boy back through the gate, and they return to animation.
Wow. Now, you mentioned you've used animation for the parts of depicting life in the orphanage, but then live action once he steps outside. And why? I'm curious, that feels symbolic of something. What was your choice for using that kind of contrast?
Normally, when film uses live action and animation together, the animated world is the good world. It's the place where the main characters go to escape their horrible lives, and they can either forget about their problems or they learn some magical lesson that helps them come back and make their life better. Think Christopher Robin, A Wrinkle in Time, Pete's Dragon, Mary Poppins, even Pan's Labyrinth is in the similar vein. So we are turning that animation trope on its head, where the animated world is the horrible world. It's a place you do not want to be. And the real world has so much to offer. It's where Izidor experiences love and belonging for the first time. And just like anybody else's story, once you can relate to them, and we can all relate to the need to belong, then someone's story is no longer a story. It's no longer just a film either. It becomes this truth that you have to contend with. So people tend to think of orphans as kids with runny noses in these pictures from the other side of the planet, but these are human beings. And how would we treat parentless children if we actually believed that they were real and human and valuable like we are?
Wow. I love that picture you're painting too, where the real world is live action. I mean, it seems to speak to what we were talking about earlier, that the real world of the triune God has made, the life we were made for, is one of belonging. And when you step into rich relationships and community and that transformative power, it's like you're stepping out of the illusion into reality. But often we can feel like we're in this, not the life we were made for. And the animated world, that feels like a picture of kind of life under the fall and the conditions of the fall with that isolation, alienation.
Right.
And I know one of the things that you're wanting to spotlight with this film too is some of the problems with global orphanages. I remember years ago being shocked to discover, this may be new for some of us tonight, but can you talk about what are some of the, I think often we think about orphanages overseas, we say, oh, that's a great thing, let's throw money at that, but there can be some problems that I think actually have a deeper theological root. Can you talk about what's some of the problems with orphanages globally?
So right now there are about 8 million kids worldwide that are still in orphanages. And we know through research that compared to kids who grow up in families, kids who grow up in institutions are set up for a lifetime of issues psychologically, emotionally, socially. So what a lot of people don't know is that 80% of those kids are not orphans. They actually have at least one living parent. So what's going on systemically that parents and society is thinking that a child growing up in an institution is a better solution than growing up at home? And what about the 20% that do need families? How do we find families for them? And how do we train them so that they can help children truly heal from their trauma? So these are some of the systemic and local issues that we're hoping to address with the film. Definitely.
I remember you talked about, why would a parent, but it's traveling internationally, one of the things that they'll tell you is sometimes parents have the perception of, it's better education that they'll get here, a better opportunity for a better life. So they might step back into the shadows and want their kids to go. But as Reuters reports, the impact is a tragic, very different. One other thing to mention too is it's also a major trafficking issue where orphanages are a big moneymaker business. And so traffickers will at times kidnap children to fill quotas in institutions because they know it tugs on the heartstrings of international donors. So this is a quote from Reuters on the impact of orphanages. It says, research shows orphanages harm children's social, emotional, and cognitive development. Institutionalization of very young children has a similar impact on early brain development to severe malnutrition and maternal drug use during pregnancy. Young adults raised in institutions are 10 times more likely to fall into sex work than their peers and 500 times more likely to take their own lives. Placing a child in an orphanage quadruples the risk of sexual violence. I remember being in Cambodia years ago, we were talking, and I was talking to a guy who'd been a missionary there 20 years, and I said, hey, you have any advice for me as I'm stepping in? And he said, hey, first thing, just don't come back and tell me you want to start an orphanage. And I was like, okay, how come, why? And he said, well, hey, use an example, like if you got hit by a train tomorrow, right? Or you and Holly died, what would you hope would happen to your kids? I'm like, well, they go with my parents or our best friends. It's like, exactly. Historically, like you have extended family networks, you have networks of belonging and relationship. And one of the challenges is, this is an example of people getting plucked out of belonging, relationship, network, and getting put into an institution where maybe the physical needs are met, but there's a lot of other things that are lacking.
I think a really good way to sum it up is the old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you remember Abraham Maslow? He was an American psychologist from the 1940s, and he came up with this theory that we still use today. And the theory is that all people have these basic human needs that must be met before they can even think about moving up the ladder, if you will, to these higher level needs. For example, the first three, psychological needs. Everybody needs air, water, food, sleep. Then secondarily, we start thinking about personal safety. Is my body safe? Do I have employment as a way to get more resources, to get more food? And then finally, love and belonging, friendship and intimacy. So you can argue that orphanages provide the first two, some better than others, but love and belonging happens in one-on-one relationship in a family, and that doesn't happen in an institution. And as you saw at the top where Izidor was talking to Morgan Freeman about going home with Onisha and how it completely changed his life. It literally opened his brain.
Well, tonight is not ultimately about orphanages, family adoption, but we wanted to use these as windows into the reality that for all of us that we were made to belong, we were made for belonging. But I do find it a powerful gospel image that God adopts us into his family. Psalm 69 says, God is a father to the fatherless. He sets the lonely in families, not in institutions, but in families where there's belonging and relationship. And that image of adoption, it's a gospel reality for all of us who are in Christ. And so I'm curious, now you're also an adoptive parent, Sarah. You and your husband, Chris, you're an adoptive parent to 7 children, all adopted at different ages from different places around the world, using different adoption methods. And while the New Testament uses both adoption and natural birth as images for our salvation, they are different. Can you talk a little about some of the difference that you've shared with me of how you see adoption as different or distinct from natural birth?
Adoption is an amazing, beautiful thing. I recommend it. I've been adoptive parent trainer for many years, and like you said, I've done it 7 times. We have this thing in the adoption world called Gotcha Day, which is when a child comes home for the very first time, and you kind of mark that date on the calendar. And some families actually celebrate it annually, like a birthday. So I'm very blessed and very grateful that I get to walk through life with my kids. But that's usually the end of what most people know about adoption. For example, just a couple weeks ago, I was at the doctor with my daughter, and the nurse figured out she was adopted, and she goes, oh, tell me your adoption story. I just love adoption stories. Tell me about it. And what people don't realize is that's a really difficult question, because do I tell her the story she expects to hear, or do I tell her the truth? Which is that all adoption starts because of a tragedy. A child has left the place where he belongs. He can no longer stay with his family for whatever reason. And for some kids, that's harder than other kids. The loss is big, some may not feel it as much. For example, my kids from China, they lost not only their language, but they lost their entire 5,000-year culture, music, art, dance, medicine, everything. And now they were brought to a place where they're raised by parents who don't look like them, and they grow up as a minority instead of a majority. So it's really not fair to cloak all that loss in this gown of adoption magic as if it didn't happen or doesn't still affect them. We have this saying in the adoption world. It goes like this: adoption loss is the only trauma in the world where the victim is expected by the whole of society to be grateful. Why is that? I think it has to do with who's telling the narrative. And it's from the adult's perspective, right? For the parent, it's all good. But for the child, it's not all good, even if it is good. So we have to make space for kids to be able to express that kind of grief and that disappointment. And that's a lot different from raising biological children. So kids no longer are in the place where they belong. They can be recreated with adoption, but it's not simple.
So theologically, it makes me think, natural birth is a window into creation, but adoption has a unique window into redemption, right? Because it assumes the fall, it assumes a tragedy, and the freedom to be able to grieve, permission to grieve that loss, and yet also this process of being brought into relationship. And as a window, again, so many of us here tonight are, maybe you and I, you might not be adopted, I'm not adopted, and yet adoption is a gospel reality for all of us, where God is wanting to bring us out of some of the brokenness of the fall, the alienation, isolation, and bring us into healthy, redemptive relationships in the family of God and with others and with people. Kind of like we talked about earlier tonight, that in the same way that there can be damage in our upbringing, healthy relationships and belonging has the power to bring healing. Well, Sarah, I'm interested, again, Psalm 69, it says, God's a father to the fatherless. He sets the lonely in families. God doesn't set the lonely in institutions. He sets them in families. And I think this is because we were made to belong, right? And it's interesting, though, I found that there's a distinction between an orphanage and a family, the idea of being brought into an orphanage and a family. And sometimes I think we can tend to treat the church more like an orphanage than a family, right? If you think about some of the differences here, orphanage, the focus is more on functional needs, food and water and basic things. But in a family, there's an emphasis on relational needs as well, being connected, being known, that I actually have healthy relationships in which I'm known. Knowledge, it's kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy we were talking about. In an orphanage, you can get knowledge. There's education often, teachers, things of that nature. But you might get the facts and figures, but you can be missing out on the relational wisdom, wisdom that actually comes in relationship, again, by being known, being mentored, and brought into life. And then similarly, in the orphanage, there can be an emphasis on performance. Do you have a good enough behavior, keeping your grades up, all right? But in family, there's belonging. There's a sense of, we've got you, even when you make mistakes, when you fall. And I believe that's God's heart, both for the church, that we would not approach the church as an orphanage, where sometimes we can, I think, approach the church on the functional side of just going well, hey, this is where I go to get my spiritual fix, kind of get some teaching, download a sermon or something for the week, rather than being known, being in relationship, and the church is a family. We can go to the church sometimes just for knowledge, again, to kind of download a sermon or whatever, but not for the life transformation that comes through wisdom of being in relationship with others. And likewise, we can approach church sometimes as performance, I just got to be a good person and keep my nose clean, versus the security of the gospel, going God's got you in the gospel, and that's known together with brothers and sisters and family. Raises the question, are you treating the body of Christ more as a orphanage or a family? Well, Sarah, could you maybe we close this part, can you talk about what's next? How close is the film to completion, and how can we support it? As a community, how can we rally behind you?
Yes, we spent 5 weeks in Romania last fall, filming the live action portion of this film. Can I show you a clip?
Yeah, great, please.
Thank you.
How can we rally around you? Yeah.
Thank you. So we are now post-production on the filming side, and now we are working on the animation side. And so we are needing to raise another $200,000 for the animation and then to edit all together with sound design and color correction and post-production. So we are set up to take tax-free, or I'm sorry, tax
Tax-free.
Tax
Deductible.
Tax deductible,
Yeah.
Thank you. Tax deductible
You
donations.
will no longer have to pay any taxes.
Ever.
Ever.
And you get to say you're taking care of orphans and mean it. And so we are looking for donations. We also are looking for partnerships with an animation company or perhaps a large donor or two that wants to, in exchange for producer credit, work with us.
Cool. Yeah, so no pressure, but if that's something you'd love to support, we want to rally around you and are excited for this work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you. And hey, so we want to take some time now to discuss around tables. And the discussion question I'd love for you to process around your tables. You can pick any one of these three questions, but they are, where do you most experience belonging? Or if you feel so comfortable, to share, where has belonging been broken for you? Or with whom are your most intimate forms of connection and belonging? Let's break for discussion now.
Okay, let's go ahead and bring the conversation in. What's that? They don't want to stop. All right. Well, I want to have a panel now discussing hospitality. Now, when you think of hospitality, who comes to mind? Just throw some names out there, some famous people. Sarah and Brentley are not famous, but they are definitely it. I heard Martha Stewart, and the answer is correct. When you think of hospitality, oftentimes we think of Mr. Rogers. You think of having a dinner party, entertaining people, and making nice little crafts and the perfect little food. And that is not what Scripture talks about when it talks about hospitality. Hospitality is commanded a number of times in Scripture as the way that we relate to one another. And Jesus-shaped hospitality is about making space and welcoming the other, especially the stranger, someone who's overlooked, someone who's alone, someone who might even be framed as your enemy. And I think that this word, which tends to be perceived as this trivial little elective, is one of the most crucial things for us right now. Because we live in a world where for the last 2 years, we weren't doing great at hospitality anyways. But for the last 2 years, we have been trained that other people are biological weapons and you need to get distance from them. It's a a way of life that's contrary to the gospel, to flourishing, to shalom, and we need to be retrained again in how to be hospitable to one another. So we've got a panel here that's going to talk about it. This panel is some people in the church who have some unique experiences. Number one, I've been telling them for weeks that we have a tribe. I've told them there's a phrase, tribe of sages. I'm not going to tell you what it means until a few weeks later. Today's the day when they find out. That there are a group of people who are like mothers and fathers in this church who welcome people and who have this practical, functional adoption and welcome them into their life, and in such a way that really reflects the heart of God. And there's a bunch of them, but these are three right here. So we're going to learn from them, and I've picked them for this very particular reason, that all three of them have lived in another country and know what it's like to be the outsider needing hospitality. And also they are people who have really displayed and demonstrated that in their lives as well. So with that said, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a 30-second little snapshot of your cross-cultural experience, those sorts of things. So Steve, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah, Steve. My career has been either missionary or an engineer.
Engineers are known for hospitality, right?
That's where, yeah, as a missionary, I learned most of this stuff. Engineers, no, they need to grow in that area for sure. But let's see, cross-culturally, I have had a lot of experience with Southeast Asians in my 20s. Refugees that were coming over. I had worked in a refugee camp, and so Vietnamese, Cambodians, Thai, not Thai, but Malaysian, some other cultures there. And then more in my 30s with Cambodians, and then lately, and Chinese. Just my wife and I had been to China for 4 years. And then more recently in Turkey, which you well know. I've been there. And I would say we probably learned most of what we know about hospitality from the Turks.
How long did you live in Turkey?
10 years.
10 years. Yeah. Great. Lori, what would you add to that?
Well, my story follows his a lot, but early in university is when I was on the East Coast, and there was a lot of diversity. So in the English program where I was, there were a lot of Koreans, South Koreans, and a lot of Malaysians. So we ended up working together a lot. And then I went to Japan short term, and then the Lord told me to go over to China. So spent time in China, then Turkey, working with Cambodians with Steve as well.
That's great. And Carrie?
I'm Carrie. And we spent 15 years living and serving in China. Most of our time there was spent doing theological training and equipping of underground churches. So we just moved to Phoenix a little over 2 years ago, and have been serving refugees in the city since then. So most recently, a lot of the Afghan community that has ended up in Phoenix, and that's been a real gift.
So the primary reason I want you up here is not because the only way that we extend hospitality is across international and cultural boundaries, although that's a big part of it, but because I've noticed that people who've crossed those boundaries have faced the complexities of hospitality and themselves have had to be recipients of it in ways that are often uncomfortable. And I would be curious, I would love to hear a story of how you have been a recipient of hospitality in a way that has shaped you. So Lori, how about we start with you?
Sure. When we landed in Turkey, we had to get an apartment, and the apartments in Turkey have nothing. They have no light bulbs, they have no appliances. Everything has to be provided by you. So we were in our late 30s, and we had 3 little children, and we had an apartment, and we had to somehow get all of this together. So our neighbors across the hall, they saw our problem. We had no language at the time, But they communicated with us with a lot of pointing, and they took us to all the places that we needed to go to. And it was so overwhelming because with 3 little children and coordinating it and not having the language, and they saw our need. And so I know after we had gotten some of the appliances, some of the light bulbs were hung, I wanted to thank her, and I'm using my little yellow Turkish dictionary, and I'm trying to thank her, and she kept using the word. She says, yalnısın, yalnısın, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. And so she flipped in my dictionary, and she showed me the word, and yalnız means you're alone. And for us to be alone was the worst possible condition that we could be in. And so because we were alone, we had no one to help us, they had that need to help us and support us. And they became our family. They took my children. We went to the beach with them. We were family. We were invited into their home. Whenever I found something in the market that I didn't know how to cook, I would go over to Zeynep teyze and I'd say, can you show me how to cook this? And she would show me how to cook it.
That's great. Well, Steve, why don't you tell us about some of the things you've learned about hospitality, some of the tangible things from living in Turkey?
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, one of the biggest things I learned was just that work is secondary, that relationship, friendships, connection is primary. I think here in the States, we're so used to, producing and performing, and when we're at work, we're focused. We don't want to be interrupted. We want to get our job done and meet the deadlines and things like that. But in Turkey, you're working along, and if somebody knocks on your office door and says, here I am, it might be a friend, it might be just an acquaintance, you drop everything, and you put the chai on, and it means they're going to be there. Like when you have chai in Turkey, it means you're going to spend time together, at least a half hour, probably an hour. And so you're in the middle of your workday, and you're spending an hour at least a day, maybe more, depends on who stops by, sitting with this person, having chai, talking about whatever, and getting to know them. So that was really kind of eye-opening for me, and it's helped me here in the States, too, because as an engineer, focused on my computer screen or whatever, doing my work, I can forget about people.
They're kind of a big deal.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting when you say that. It's the observation I had is that there's a way to structure your life with enough margin that anticipates the surprise interruption of someone created in God's image. And where we're used to structuring our lives to where we squeeze every little minute of potential productivity out, we're squeezing the other out. We're squeezing the image of God out of our lives and that opportunity. So that's really that margin, even to be interrupted during work. Carrie, why don't you tell us something about what you've learned from living in China about hospitality?
Yeah, I think of the last city that we lived in was in the Northeast, and we had lived in an apartment maybe 3 days when there was a water pipe issue, and I just couldn't figure out how to solve it. And one of the grandmothers that lived near us came to my door, and she said, I see that you have this problem. Just give me your keys, and I will take care of it. And so I was on my way at the door, so I just tossed her my keys and thought, well, we'll just see how it goes. So I came back that night with a kitchen full of probably 5 workers, and they were finishing up, and the pipe was done. And as an American, I would say, oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you didn't have to do that. And the response every time when I say thank you to her or to anyone else was, oh, sure, well, in Gaida, like this is what I should be doing. And they would explain every time you say thank you, or every time you say, oh, you shouldn't have done that, it puts a distance in our relationship. Because this is what I should be doing. And I think over the course of 15 years, I worked my way out of saying thank you often, because when they were doing something for me, or when they were buying me noodles, or when they were bringing me medicine when I didn't know that I needed it, what they were saying, I wanted a relationship that was no strings attached, right? Like, I'm gonna bring you dinner and like, we're good. But my Chinese friends, when they looked at my understanding of a relationship with no strings attached, that feels really cold. So like, the more strings, the better, because we need to be obligated to one another. And I think that in moving back, I think we as Americans hate being obligated to any system, structured relationship. We just don't like to be obligated. But at the same note, I see people saying things like, I just want to be seen. But that doesn't happen void of obligation to one another. And so I think my Chinese friends really worked that out of me, that desire for independence and the desire for relationships where there's not an obligation.
That's really good. Yeah, I mean, even this Sunday, I'm going to be bringing up Romans 12, where it says that we are members of one another. That we are, like the kidney does not get to say, I'm on my own. And that it's the most important membership we have. Costco can just whatever, but our membership to one another is huge. Tell us about the cost of hospitality, because I think a lot of times when we think of hospitality, we just think of these rich times where you're just together and this relationship's going great and you're knowing and being known, but there's a cost to it. Lori, would you speak to that?
Sure. I feel like you said, the cost is time, and we frame time differently. And so in Turkey, they broke the day up into the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. And so they had margin, like you said. And so coming back to the States after that time, I just realized everybody had an hour. I have an hour. I have to take my kid to a music lesson. It's an hour. So we broke up our days into hours and filled every hour. And so I learned over there to restructure my time. And that was something I had to, a cost. But I think a larger cost was I had to give up my cultural identity as a Western woman, because in Turkey leaves 50% of their workforce is people who support this value of hospitality, and that's women. That women are the ones who buy, who cook, who entertain, and not only do they do that, they do it behind the screen. So it's the men who are out there, but the women are behind it. And so for me to participate in that, I had to die to what my views, my conversations as a Western woman went from maybe talking about books and literature to recipes and learning to do needlework, things like this, trying to enter in to who they were. And so to do that, I had to put aside a lot of what I had been grown up to be as a Western woman, my whole culture.
Yeah. I would be curious for each of you to just speak to some like real, tangible, this is how, like for a bunch of people who've been learning how to not be around people for a while, give us some steps to take, some tangible things, and how to receive one another. Steve, let's start with you.
Well, I'll go back to my work example. What I've done at work is force myself to get up out of my desk and go around and meet somebody new every day. I do that at work, and it's become a fun thing, an enjoyable thing. And I find that those people are very ready to talk and connect, because I think there are a lot of lonely people at work. One thing tangible, a friend of mine did who had visited Turkey and saw this going on with the work culture. When he went back to work in the States, he actually bought a chai danluk, a tea set, put it next to his desk with a little chair and a table, and he invited people to come and sit with him during work, and it worked really well. People would come and they would, enjoy that time with him. So
that's great. So structuring your space and then even
Right.
intentionally seeking out, not just, yeah.
I think sometimes, you touched on this, Jim, at the beginning, our perspective of hospitality is like this perfect home, and they're always coming into our home. But then I look at Scripture, and so often Jesus is going out, right? He's like, your friends and family, they're easy to hang out with. Go find the blind, and go find the beggar, and go find, which requires us to be hospitable outside of our homes. And I think we forget that as we kind of flow through our day, we all have familiar strangers, right? We all have the lady at the cash register that we see every Thursday. We all have the barista that is the same barista that we always see, or the guy at the bank or whatever. We have these familiar strangers, and I think we have to risk the awkwardness of, hey, the security guard at the bottom of my building or whatever, hey, I'm gonna bring you coffee tomorrow, what's your order? So not even asking, hey, would you like coffee? Just assert it. Hey, I'm bringing you dinner on Thursday. What's a good time, and do you have any allergies? And it can be very awkward, but I don't know that I've ever been rejected when I've just asserted something like that. Because I think for a long time, I checked off my hospitality box by saying, hey, we should go get coffee. And then we never did it. But in my mind, I offered, so that was good. Hey, we should get dinner sometime. And then we never did it. And so I discovered, people in grief saying, I'm coming over and I'm bringing dinner. And maybe you just leave it on their doorstep. But I think we have to risk the awkwardness, because that's very countercultural to how we as Americans function. We kind of wait for invitations, or we offer invitations, but we kind of do this dance, is that okay? And I just don't know anyone who's going to be offended if you just bring them a free coffee. And so these familiar strangers, hey, what time's your break tomorrow? Can I just bring you salad and go? And we'll sit down for 15 minutes and, and that's it.
Yeah. We, Lori, how about you? And then, yeah.
Oh.
Sorry, I almost launched into a little monologue there because it was so good, but yeah.
So hospitality, the word actually means love the stranger. And so we have Philadelphia, loving your brothers, and then Philoxenia, loving the stranger. And what's so interesting is in Leviticus, that's where God says, you will love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you think of Israel was just one big family, so they're loving their family. But at the end of that chapter, it says, you will love the foreigner as your native born. So in other words, you're going to love the foreigner as your family too. So that idea of bringing the stranger into the kingdom, right? So we were brought out of darkness into the kingdom of the Son that he loves. We've been brought into the kingdom. So I feel like you were talking about the importance of hospitality, that as Christians, that should be our brand. We should be known for bringing the foreigner in. And so I feel like practically, what? Practically any way that we can do that. And I feel like for me, it's hard. We live down near where there's a lot of homeless. And so I'm overwhelmed every time I see a homeless person by the homeless issue. And then one day I saw a homeless man. He was literally at our gate. And I was walking out to go running. And I was like, God, what do I do? He's at my gate. This is the story of Lazarus right here. And I thought, okay, it's COVID. I'm a woman. And I felt God just say, do what you can. Do what you can. And I thought, okay, what can I do? I can go home and I can fill a bag with things this guy can eat. And so I did that, and I took it out to him, and I sat with him, and I talked to him a little bit. He was laying on the ground, not moving. I didn't even know if he was dead or alive. But when I put the food there, and I kind of said, "Are you okay? Here it is." He perked up. We had a conversation. He said, "I'm just trying to get over to the bus stop." So that was really, for me, practical. Yeah. Lori, it's do what you can. You don't have to take the whole on.
That's good. That's good. Do what you can. And then I'm going to give my one nugget here is it would be a disaster if we are a community of people who are looking around saying, I need someone to show me hospitality. Because then we're just going to have a bunch of people judging everyone else for not showing them to do it. But we will be a community of kinship adoption, of adopting one another, knowing and being known, if we all take the posture of, I've got my eyes open to receive and move towards welcoming the other in this church and those beyond the walls of this church. So we're gonna send you to the table with a question. Here's your one question. What was your phrase? Do what you can, right? What is the do what you can in your life that God's stirring you to do right now? So go ahead and discuss that around your tables, and then our next panel will be up in just a moment.
All right, let's bring it back in. Hey, my name is John Crawford. I'm one of the pastors here, and we are going to do our next panel. What is the ministry of the ear? Shout it out what you think the ministry of the ear is. Listening. Yes, you guys are great. Listening. Easy enough, right? But it's a unique way to talk about listening. But listening is directly connected to belonging. And the reason why I like to call listening the ministry of the ear is because listening is a means of loving others. It's a means of loving others because every single person has a story. All of us sitting in this room this evening, we all have stories. All of our stories are wildly different, but yet our stories have led to this moment sitting in this room together. And so by listening, we love others by learning their stories, because at the deepest root of every single one of us, every one of us longs to be known and loved. And so by listening well, we actually enable others to be known, and yet we can love them through listening. And so for this panel, we're going to be talking about listening, but we're not going to be talking about why listening is important. I think all of us know, hey, listening is important, but a lot of people don't know how to listen well. And so we are going to be talking for the next few minutes about kind of practically, how do you listen? How do you listen to people? And so I am joined by some incredible folks that I deeply respect. And we've chosen these folks to be on the panel because they are in vocations that require them to be excellent listeners. And so I'm going to have you guys introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, so I'm Jordan Williams. I previously worked as
you got some fans.
That's right.
Warren in the back. Warren's your biggest fan.
Wife to Warren Williams, and I previously worked as a clinical therapist, but just transitioned to a new role as a dean of students at a local charter school. So spent a lot of time just talking to teens and their families.
Hello, family. I'm Eric Ludwig. I'm one of your elders here, but by day, wife to Amy Ludwig, or husband to Amy Ludwig. Husband.
Hey, that's a different panel here.
Just making sure you're listening.
This isn't Josh's gender panel.
That's right. That's right. So by day, I'm a professional life coach. I spend time basically asking questions, and then it helps if I do listen to the answers. So, yeah. Yeah,
it's great. Yeah, thanks for being here, guys. Seriously, really appreciate it. First, before I start asking them questions, the first thing that we all need to realize about listening is that good listening starts when the conversation is not about you. Good listening starts when you first ask the question, how can I make this conversation about the other person? That's the starting point. So everything else that we're about to say, if you don't start there, it won't be good listening. Okay, so that's fundamentally the first question is, how can I make this conversation about the other person? And so what I would love to hear from you guys, Eric and Jordan, what is your favorite question to ask people?
Yeah, my favorite questions are future-oriented. So, hey, what are your hopes for tonight? Or what are your hopes for this week? Or, hey, when you're there, what will that do for you? Or if they're in a particular situation, well, what do you want instead? So it's helpful to kind of put people in the future with questions, getting them to think that way.
And I was racking my brain earlier, kind of figuring out, do I have a favorite question?
I stole your answer, though.
A little bit, yeah. But I think ultimately it is kind of like a favorite category of question, which is actually more so the follow-up question, is that I realized that the initial one, it has some weight to it, but the questions that dig a little bit deeper beneath the surface, like the follow-up where, if you're making the conversation about the other person, not allowing them to just put the question back on you and say, well, what about you? But actually asking the follow-up questions to dig a little bit deeper and do some excavation.
I know we were talking, waiting in line for the fry bread, and Jordan's like, hey, what's your favorite question? And I said it, and she's like, that's mine. So she's not saying it because she's letting me say it, but we both actually had the same question, which is, what has that been like for you? Mm-hmm. And so like if you're trying to get into another person's world and their story and their experience, and you don't maybe understand, asking them, what has that been like for you? And I know that you've used that a lot even in therapeutic settings, right? Yeah. So I think another thing a lot of us are familiar with, open-end and close-ended questions. We've all learned the difference between those, but I would love to hear just from you guys, what have you found are some good open-ended questions to ask people that get like the conversation going?
Yeah, so I find that any question that starts with a few different words, something like when, how often, how long, something like, hey, when did you first notice, that this was a struggle for you? That allows them to open up, to actually reflect, think about when was the first time that I noticed that, versus a closed-ended question, just being, you okay?
Yeah, and that works as a parent too. How was school? Fine. But hey, what was one of your favorite moments today? So the more specific you can make with an open-ended question, something that causes people to think, then that can really get the conversation flowing.
That's good. Outside of asking some of these helpful open-ended questions, what are some other ways or other things that people can do to improve their listening?
Yeah, I'd say probably the number one suggestion, and I'm hoping the husbands in the rooms are listening as well, but is following a question with a reflection, meaning you repeat back in a more like recap manner what they have said. Oh, that sounds really challenging. That sounded like a difficult conversation you had. Something that shows that you have listened, and what that does, it helps the other person feel heard, and it creates a sense of trust as well. And so following questions with reflections, probably the number one practical tip I could share.
That's great. You're really good at that too, by the way.
So you're happy with my answer?
Yes, I am.
No, that's good. Yeah, reflective listening is definitely something that I would say, like both professions, we preach a lot. Something else that I would probably suggest for reflection, maybe when you're in the midst of a conversation, is checking in with yourself about whether this is actually a conversation or two parallel monologues. Because I think it is really easy when one person asks a question, for the other person to kind of give their response, and then that tips the other person, oh, that reminds me of the time and then it just becomes this tennis match of, well, that reminds me of the time that instead of it actually being something that, you're digging deeper into one person's life and their experience and really, giving them the space and the opportunity to spend time reflecting, versus it being, two parallel monologues where maybe neither one ends up feeling very well known at the end of it.
That's good. Hey, so what have you found to be the worst type of question to ask? Like, what should people not do? What are those type of questions, or the question like, hey, this is not helpful?
I'll throw myself under the bus because I know that I'm guilty of this sometimes. But asking a question that is more like self-serving, maybe when you're asking with the expectation that you get to share your own experience of like, hey, have you ever noticed this about something, and you're not actually waiting for their response. You're just waiting for them to say no so that you can share what, your own observation. And so I've had to check myself sometimes when I know I'm actually asking this question so I can answer. I'm not actually waiting for your response.
That's great.
That's good.
A couple other tips. Try not to use the word why. Try not to lead a question with why, because that generally puts people on the defensive. Why are you late? Versus, hey, what are some reasons you weren't able to make it home on time? See how different that is? I mean, leading with why is a quick way to get into trouble. Another practical thing that's helpful if you don't do is stack your questions. Ask a lot of questions at once. Hey, how was your day? Did you have that lunch? Did you pick this up on the way home? And what do you want for dinner? And that's not really helpful either. So kind of one question at a time, wait for a response. That can help move the conversation along.
It's great. The why one is great.
Yeah.
You took my answer this time. I took your answer, you took my answer. But the why one is great because it puts people on defensive, and there's other ways to ask that get to the same question, the heart of the question. Yeah. So last question that I have for you guys is, if someone is desiring to become a better listener, practically, how can they grow in listening? So outside of just the questions that we just talked through, practically, how can someone grow in listening to become a better listener? What are some things they could do?
Yeah, pick one person and practice. And if reflection isn't coming as naturally, you can just use simple like, hey, what else? Or tell me more about that. Or just something to keep the conversation focused on the other person. That would be a quick tip there.
That's great.
And I think prayer-wise, I think going before the Lord and asking for, to be equipped with the listener's heart and to maybe for God to show you, maybe to highlight some ways that maybe you haven't been the best listener. So asking for that increased awareness of maybe ways that you have fallen short as a listener lately, and asking for, the wisdom to step into that role of having a listener, having more of a listener's heart. And even maybe when you're spending time in prayer, recognizing how much listening are you doing, even in that relationship. During that prayer, when you're asking to be a better listener, are you actually spending some time in listening prayer during that process?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that several years ago that I said, man, I really want to grow in listening. I could talk people's ears off, and I'm an extrovert, right? So I'm a talker. I made it like a spiritual discipline to grow in listening. And one of the things that I did is I created this practice, the 80-20 rule. Not how we often think of that, of 20% of people do all the work, not that way. 80-20, in conversation with people, I would only speak 20% of the time. which means in a conversation, 80% of that, I'm listening and I'm guiding the conversation with questions. And then I'm speaking when someone asks me and like gives me the permission to speak. Because once again, if I'm making the conversation about the other person, then I want to listen. And so I have this kind of 80-20 rule that I've stuck to, and it's actually a spiritual discipline of mine, because I do believe listening is one of the ways that we actually participate in God's work in the world. Psalm 116 talks about how God is a listener, that he actually bends down and inclines his ear to us. And so we can actually incline our ears to others as we play a role in his mission, because the reality is a lot of people need to belong before they believe. And just for us, if we listen well, it enables people to belong. Just to close out, there's an author that says this, quote, says, remember that everyone you meet is afraid of something, loves something, and has lost something. Everyone you meet is afraid of something, loves something, and has lost something. And so by listening to other people, we actually enable them to be known, and we enable them to belong. Would you thank Eric and Jordan for being on this panel? All right, Josh Butler is going to close us out here.
All right. Well, hey, thank you for all the questions that came in. You can be looking for our upcoming All of Life podcast episode where we're going to dive in deeper around those. A lot of you have sent in some great questions, so be looking for that upcoming podcast on our All of Life podcast. Also, if you are able, on your way out, if you're available to stick around for 5-10 minutes and help tear down the tables out front, if Mike Belitho, if you can stand up, dude, the guy, red hat, come on, there we go. Mike, yes, he is gonna, yeah, Mike's amazing, he is amazing, yes. You belong, my friend, you belong. Mike is gonna be leading the teardown crew, so if you're able to take a few minutes and help, that would save us a ton of time, that would be amazing. Big picture though, may we cultivate belonging. May we be a people who cultivate belonging. As we've seen tonight, the Trinity, the triune God, is a relational God who's made you for community, to know and be known. And yes, it's tragic when those healthy relationships get broken and become unhealthy relationships, but there is power in healthy, healing relationships. There's healing power God can do in healthy relationships. So we want to be a people who cultivate belonging, as we've seen tonight, with some practical ways like hospitality, receiving the other, and also with listening, of really seeking to know other people and their story. And so we want to be a people who cultivate belonging. And with that, as you're heading out, there's a song that's going to be playing. Sarah, can you explain just the song that's going to be playing as we walk out?
Sure. We were lucky enough to have an original song written for a film. It's called Too Kind. And the basis of belonging and how to make people feel that they belong is kindness, right? The Bible says it's God's kindness that draws us to him. So the song is about encouraging people to be kind even when you don't know the future and it may not turn out the way you think it is. That is still what we should do.
Awesome. And our hope is that you can find belonging here in the family of God. Go in peace.